There we go. My name is Jim Alexander, and I'm the author of Dodgers, an Informal History from Flatbush to Chavez Ravine. And today I'm talking to Terence Moore, who is the author of a wonderful book about Hank Aaron. It's called The Real Hank Aaron. And one thing I'm curious about, it almost seems like it's almost more of a memoir than it is anything else. And if you could kind of explain, Terence, how you came to that idea that this is the best way to tell this story.
Jim, that's a great question. And a lot of this, and I'm going to answer that in two ways. One, there have been literally hundreds of books written about Hank Aaron, hundreds of film type entities done on Hank Aaron, documentaries, what have you, articles, magazine stories. So my thing was to try to find a different way to tell the Hank Aaron story beyond the fact that I knew Hank Aaron better than anybody. We had a 40-year friendship, and I was closer to him than any other reporter, I should say. His family members knew him pretty well, I would dare say.
Yeah.
At that point. So I had that uniqueness where 90% of the stuff has never been said before about Hank. But I also wanted to do it in a different way. And I thought this was a good approach. And the other thing is, the book is very much about the symmetry between Jackie Robinson, Hank's idol, Hank Aaron, and myself. And I did it that way also because it became very apparent to me very soon in my relationship with Hank Aaron that one of the reasons we got along so well is we were so similar. We had similar backgrounds, but in a different generation. And one of the things, like right behind me right here, I got this poster of Hank Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
I bought this Hank Aaron poster when I was 12 years old back in 1968. I was a diehard fan. So I go from that poster, buying that at the age of 12, still in perfect condition, by the way, to being an honorary pallbearer at his funeral. And so that's why, in a long-winded way, I did it that way, because to tie all those things together and to make it a very unique read.
You know what surprises me, and you mentioned it at various points in the book, that you got that poster at 12 years old and it's still in mint condition. Most things that a 12-year-old gets are trashed by the time he's 13 or 14. I mean, it sounds like you recognized at the start that, hey, this is something and someone special, even before you ever got to meet him.
And I'll tell you something, Jim, and I got another poster at the same time. It's on the other side of the wall, and it was Pete Rose. We moved to Cincinnati. My dad was an AT&T supervisor. So I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, a little university there called the University of Notre Dame.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. We moved to Cincinnati in 68 at the same time as the Big Red Machine. And I get chills thinking about that because, that was my team. I love the Big Red Machine. I love the Big Red Machine, but I also loved Hank Aaron. So when I was 12, I took my model car money that I got from doing various things, and I bought two posters. This Hank Aaron poster and the Pete Rose poster done by the same person. And both those posters went with me and have gone with me everywhere. When we moved again from Cincinnati in 71 to Chicago, the posters went. 72 to Milwaukee. I went to school at Miami, Ohio in 74. It was on my dorm room there. I worked at Cincinnati Enquirer for 3 years there. San Francisco Examiner in Atlanta. So it's a miracle it stayed intact, but it also tells you about how it was meant to be, this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Hank and myself.
Now talk about how that relationship got started. I mean, the whole thing about media covering ball players, and in the past it was possible to strike up a friendship and to develop a close relationship with a player. I mean, it's almost impossible now because these guys all have their own brands and they keep all but a few at arm's length. But talk about how how you kind of struck that up.
Well, Jim, I'm going to start with this. I'm a Christian, And I always believe there's no such thing as coincidence. Everything is meant to happen for a reason. And this Hank Aaron story that I'm involved with, and because I'm all through the Hank Aaron story. Now, I'm not talking about book wise. I'm just talking about just in general. There's just too much there for it not to have been something that was destiny. And I worked at the San Francisco Examiner, and this was back in the 80s. In 1982, a white baseball scout gave me this scouting report that had race on it. And I was like, whoa, what is this all about? And then when he was telling me that Major League Baseball was purposely trying to control the number of African Americans in the game, and just kind of blew me away. I had very enlightened management back then at the San Francisco Examiner, and they told me, I was covering the San Francisco Giants at the time, they said, look, take as much time as you want off and just do a detailed study of what's going on here. And it was a blockbuster story. There hasn't been anything done like this either before or since, and the things that I uncovered. But in the course of doing that, and everything was on the record, which I'm very proud of, I was just stunned how people were just honest about what was going on here, black, white, and what have you. But in the course of doing that, I had everything that I possibly needed except for one thing, and that was Hank Aaron. And Hank Aaron at the time, back in 1982, was the only black executive in Major League Baseball, if you can believe that. So I got to get Hank. Besides the Babe Ruth thing, about breaking Babe Ruth's record in the early 1970s and going through the death threats and the hate mail and that sort of thing. So Hank was a guy that I needed to get, and so I called him up on the phone. And as I point out in the book, we had this secretary, Susan Bailey, who was notorious for saying no politely. This is an example of how I was destined to get Hank, because I look back, this had to be a miracle. I get Susan. I had no idea about her reputation. Again, 1982. I'm this 26-year-old guy that only like 4 or 5 years out of college, and I want to talk to Hank Aaron. And she gets on the phone. I said, "Hey, I want to talk to Hank Aaron. I'm doing this story on blacks in baseball." And she said, "Sure, hold on." And I have to talk to Hank about that through the years. It was like, how did you get past Susan Bailey? So I get Hank, and I told Hank who I was, San Francisco Examiner, and I quickly told him that he and I had a mutual love for Jackie Robinson, because I'm a big Jackie Robinson fan. So just like that movie, I guess it's Sleepless in Seattle, instead of having him at hello, I had him at Jackie Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
And then he asked me about my background, and I gave him a quick background about me and my father being the first African-American supervisor in history of AT&T, and me and some of my first in the backgrounds. So from that point on, we just clicked. And that was the spring of 1982, and it just soared from that point on.
And I'm trying to remember what specifically for that story, for that series, what did he tell you when you brought up the subject that there's a column on the scouting reports for race?
Hank told me, and here's the thing that made that series, because I did a 7-day series after a month-long study. And the thing that was interesting about that, it was the consistency of what everybody was saying, particularly the prominent players and former players. At the time, San Francisco Giants, the manager was Frank Robinson. Mm-hmm. Joe Morgan was with the Giants back then too, another prominent black player from the 60s and 70s, and Hank Aaron. And there were others, but I just mentioned those three right there. They all said emphatically that Major League Baseball was purposely phasing out African Americans, and that there was a quota system in the game. And this was all independent of what each one told me. And so Hank was very consistent with the other guys. Hank also told me about how baseball was treating former African American players very badly, wouldn't allow them to become managers. I mean, at the time, the only black manager in Major League Baseball was Frank Robinson, mm-hmm. who had been the first black manager ever back in 1975 with the Cleveland Indians.
Right.
So what struck me from that first meeting was something that struck me every single time I talked to Hank Aaron, was how bluntly honest he was. He always had this reputation of being soft-spoken and smiling and what have you, and he was all that. But if you really listen to him, he was a guy that came hard with his opinions, and I got that from day one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just to digress slightly, talking about that series, and you see the way the game has evolved since in the 40 years since, it wasn't an accident. And today, you know, every year on Jackie Robinson Day, we do, like I did a column this year, talked to Daryl Miller of the MLB Academy, Urban Academy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like it's not getting any better. It's like, okay, and the whole thing about, well, blacks would rather play football or basketball, and that's where they get the scholarships, and there's something else there. There's really something else there.
Yeah, and Jim, I want to tell you something. I mean, I'm obviously trying to sell books, no question about it.
Sure.
But I want to tell you, anybody who reads that book, I'm talking about the entire book, if nothing else, chapter 5 that deals with blacks in baseball, it will give you chills, because everything that I wrote back at the San Francisco Examiner for that series and everything that I talk about in chapter 5, I predicted, or we predicted through the series back in 1982. And I'll run through a little bit of this. One of the things I discovered in 82 was that the high point for African Americans in the game was the mid 1970s. It was approximately 25% African American.
Mm-hmm.
By 1982, it dropped down to 19%, and that was kind of like the springboard for the series. And that's when I got over and over again from white scouts. There weren't very many black scouts, and only a handful, from general managers, that this was done on purpose. And I was told in 1982 that by the turn of the century, there will be less than 10% African Americans in the game. And what is it right now? 7%. That was all predicted.
Yeah.
So then comes this. People always say, they always ask me when I'm on different shows and what have you, and this has been going on for years. I know it's coming. I always wait for it. The naysayers, they say, well, why would Major League Baseball want to do that? That makes no sense. I mean, why would they want to keep the best? And I'm always smile when they say that ask me that question, because I answer it in two parts. Number one, why was there Jim Crow? That made no sense, because Jim Crow, if you were like a business owner, you were losing money because you were leaving out a huge part of a population out of your spending base because you're just being racist. Okay, this exactly. Says that if nothing, you want to make money, let them in. Okay, so let's get to the baseball part of it, and this ties back into Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron, one of the things that used to just make your head explode was whenever somebody would say, and this is all getting to making the point, when anybody would say that Jackie Robinson proved on April 15th, 1947, that African American could play baseball. No, that was not it. Major League Baseball knew African Americans could play. They were afraid of that. We all know about the Negro Leagues. We don't have to go forth with that. But let's go forward. Let's see what happens after Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. Very immediately, and with your Dodgers right there, you start having African Americans winning MVP awards, Cy Young awards, Rookie of the Year awards. By the time we get to the 1960s, arguably the 3 or 4 greatest players in the game for that decade were not white. Frank Robinson, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Roberto Clemente, Bob Gibson. Then you get to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the greatest team of all time, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, Big Red Machine, that was a diehard Big Red Machine fan, basically called the Big Red Machine the Big Black Machine, because they only had 2 regular white starters, Johnny Bench and Pete Rose, during the bulk of that run. 1971 All-Star game, considered one of the greatest All-Star games of all time. Both starting pitchers, African-American. The MVP of the 1971 All-Star game in Detroit was African-American, Frank Robinson. The most outstanding player, Reggie Jackson, African-American, most outstanding because he hit that famous home run to hit the light tower, right field at Tiger Stadium. So in the midst of all this, you also had in the mid-70s, the Pittsburgh Pirates did something that hasn't been done until just a few weeks ago. They fielded, for the first time in Major League Baseball, an all-black team. So all of a sudden, and I'm saying that facetiously, Major League Baseball starts putting race on the scouting reports. And that's just a long way to show, and there's a lot more to it, that this was not done by accident. This was all by design. Major League Baseball feared that African Americans were getting too prominent in the game. And one final thing along these lines, George Foster, there were others, but I think of George Foster right off the bat. George Foster was an all-star left fielder for the Big Red Machine. Later, George Foster went to the New York Mets, prominent player in the 80s. George Foster was the first player that told me this among many. Again, this is 1982. He said, the master plan for Major League Baseball, again, 1982, is to phase out African Americans and to phase in Latin players. And I asked George, I said, why is that? And George said, because everybody knows that in the baseball circles, when it comes to the white establishment, they fear Black players, African American players, that's a better term to use here, African American players, because they feel that they're not as easy, they're harder to control, put it that way, than Latin players, and the Latin players are a lot cheaper. So fast forward to today, Major League Baseball is about 27, 28, 29%. Latin players, again, 7% African American.
And the Latin players, that they can sign them at 15 and 16 years old, legally or otherwise, and get them cheap. There you go. Right, yes. Right back. The one thing, and just to digress about Jackie Robinson, going back and digging into history for my book, the day that he first took the field for the Dodgers, April 15th, 1947, I went back and looked at the New York newspapers that day. And there were like 4 or 5 different accounts of that opening day, and all of them underplayed it. The idea that you had the first African American in Major League Baseball since the 1800s, and none of them led with it. None of those beat writers had it high in their stories. It was almost like, well, if we don't mention it or we hold it to the very end, nobody will notice. So, and I wonder how much of that was racism on their part,
right,
or racism on their editor's part, or fear of racism on the reader's part, that we don't want to read about an African American player. I just wonder. And I mean, people recoil when you say this has been a racist country, but prove us wrong.
Well, it really has. And baseball and sports is a microcosm of society, because everything that we're talking about here, you can relate to society. Thus, going back to your original question, that's one reason why I'm in the book quite a bit, because you see that symmetry between what was going on with Jackie Robinson in one generation, what was going on with Hank Aaron in another generation, and what was going on with me in another generation.
Yeah.
And the similarity is incredible. But the other thing, too, you bring up a good point about Jackie Robinson's debut. The other thing that might shock people, as you know, probably, is that that game was not a sellout.
That's right.
I mean, you would think that would be like this historical event where people would be there, but yeah, it was just, it was not.
Yeah, yeah. And when you talk about Hank's career, I mean, obviously race does come into it, and the idea that he was part of that great vanguard of African American players. And I think the All-Star games through the 50s and the 60s basically were an illustration of the impact that Black players had on baseball, because most of them wound up in the National League, and the National League kept winning All-Star games, and there is a reason.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And you talk about Hank as a player. One of the things that Hank told me, there are so many things he told me that he's never told anybody else, but he really resented the fact that people did not respect how hard he worked. I mean, his work ethic was incredible. And that's not only true with Hank Aaron, that's true with a lot of Black players. That people just assume they're just a natural athlete. And that's true with a lot of Black people in general. People look at us as, you don't work very hard, or that sort of thing, for whatever reason. Well, and we know that the deep reason is racism. But Hank told me once, and this kind of shocked me, was I said, how many how many preseason exhibition games did you used to play in an average year? He said, he looked at me like I had two heads. He said, I played all of them. I never missed. I said, really? He said, yeah. He played, and he talked about he had his own routine of how he would get his legs in shape, you know, and then that sort of thing. And that's something that gets overlooked with not only Hank Aaron, but again, with a lot of great Black players, is that work ethic was always there, besides the fact just the natural talent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's like you say, it's like anything. It's the whole natural athlete thing, and
yes,
you know, it obscures a lot of things.
It does. Yeah, it really does.
Did Hank talk much about what he had to deal with in terms of, especially coming up through the minor leagues? I mean, did he have to deal with this sort of racist stuff in the minor leagues? Because I know I've talked to others about players of the 60s who came up. And one example is Bobby Bonds, who was Riverside guys. So I didn't know him, but I knew some people who were close to him. And they would tell stories about the stuff that he had to deal with in the minor leagues.
Jim, this is interesting. And that's a good question. And I find this very fascinating. The answer to your question is yes and no. Now, here's the yes part of it. I mean, he started out in Jacksonville, Florida, and you can imagine.
Oh yeah,
Florida, you know, in the early 50s, not good for a Black man. All right, and had to stay with Black families, you know, and a lot of people know that story. For all those players, they couldn't stay in the same hotels. They had to find Black families in those cities that would take them in. Mm-hmm. And matter of fact, the church I go to here in Atlanta, one of the deacons of the church was, his family was he's from West Palm Beach, Florida. His family was one of those families that would do that. So yes, he encountered that. There's no doubt about that. But the reason I've said yes and no, one of the most fascinating stories, I think, in baseball history, and maybe this might be another book for me down the line, is the love affair between Hank Aaron and Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Right before he goes to the Milwaukee Braves, 1954, that was his first major league season there. He's in Eau Claire, which was a minor league farm system for the Braves. And one of the cities that my family and I lived in, or state, we lived in Milwaukee. We moved to Milwaukee in '72, and my parents lived in Wisconsin for 28 years. And I can tell you, Wisconsin, in many ways, is like a northern southern state. Okay. Particularly once you get away from Milwaukee. Even some parts of Milwaukee is not the best.
Get into that rural
farm
country. Yep.
Yes. But Eau Claire, Wisconsin loved Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron loved Eau Claire, Wisconsin. As a matter of fact, Hank loved Wisconsin in general. I mean, it was just like this. And to this day, I mean, I bet you if you did a poll, certainly for people of age, the two greatest sports personalities in history of Wisconsin, Vince Lombardi, number one, Hank Aaron, number two. And as a matter of fact, there's like something like 5 statues of Hank Aaron in the world. I mean, he's got more statues than some of those former Soviet dictators, right? Mm-hmm. Across the country. One of the statues of Hank is in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. That's what I'm saying. That it's kind of like this mixed bag there, because the Jacksonville thing, they had the Eau Claire thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I always thought, when I'm hearing those stories about mistreatment in the minors, and there's a different sort of mistreatment these days. I mean, that's why the minor league players are unionizing now, because you know all the crap they're dealing with. But just the idea that if this is supposed to toughen guys up, then maybe you're doing it the wrong way.
Oh, no doubt about it.
But there was this old crusty idea that, well, if they can survive that, then they got a chance.
Right. You know, and some of us, Jim, too, and I didn't mention this much in my book, but in all the years I knew Hank, I cannot recall him ever saying he had a problem with any of his teammates, which I thought was remarkable. And I say that because, again, he comes to Milwaukee Braves in 1954, and there might have been was one other or two Black players on the team at the time, but again, I can't stress it enough. He loved Wisconsin. He loved Milwaukee. He loved the Milwaukee Braves. As a matter of fact, And in his latter years, he's used to spend a lot of time back in Wisconsin, giving speeches. He owns businesses there and what have you. So that to me was an interesting dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The home run chase and finally catching Babe Ruth. And I remember reading his book that came out in the early 1990s. And some of the stuff in there about the hate mail he received and some of the things that people actually wrote. And at the time, I'm thinking, my God, how does this happen? And then from this vantage point now in the year 2022, and seeing what we've seen over the last 6 to 12 years, all of a sudden it's not any better, but it makes more sense that there are people that would actually say those things and write those things.
Yeah, and I want to say this in two parts here. And this is one of the things, again, about the book that makes it so unique. I talk about that, but I talk about something that is just as deep, if not deeper, the part that nobody knew about, okay, or didn't stress, and that is that as much hatred and disdain and whatever other adjective we want to use that Hank suffered in the early 1970s during that Babe Ruth chase, which was considerable, it was almost as equal when Hank became a baseball executive with the Atlanta Braves in 1979, almost until he stopped being sort of an active part of that around 2006 or 2007. I mean, he was getting hate mail and getting drilled as a baseball executive because people were upset because he was being so outspoken and about racism in baseball, about racism in society. People forget that, okay? People want to remember Hank those last 15 or 20 years as being sort of like this good ambassador for baseball, throwing out the first pitches, what have you. And the reason I know all this because I was right there because I was the point man. I call myself the Hank Aaron Whisperer. Whenever Hank wanted to get something out, he would call me on that phone right there to get it out there, and he would catch hell and I would catch hell because of what he had to say. Even he had trouble with his own Braves organization, with racism. So that was always there. But as far as the Babe Ruth chase, there's something that I always like to mention, and I mentioned in the book. In the early 70s, that period, of course, he tied Babe Ruth in April of 1974 and also broke the record soon afterwards. Mm-hmm. But during that period of the early 70s, he was catching it from all which way and what have you. That period never left him. It always haunted him. That was always a part of Hank's life and not in the good way. As I point out in the book, he saved a lot of those hate mails and racist letters and what have you because of, Jim, what you were alluding to before. Nothing has changed nowadays. And Hank even flat out told me that in the last official interview I did with him in the fall of 2020, I should say, because he died in January 2021. The last official interview he told me was one of the reasons he saved them was he wanted to remind himself that nothing has changed and just be on the lookout because nothing did change. And the other thing, too, about that period that showed that it lived with him for the rest of his life, which I point out in the book, he was very resentful of the fact that whenever a Pete Rose would break a record, like the Ty Cobb record, or a Mark McGwire when he, theoretically broke Roger Maris's single-season home run record.
He did, and we saw it. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and there's various ways to look at PED use in baseball, but yes. I mean, my feeling is, and I'll let you get back to your point in a second, but my feeling is if the Astros are still allowed to hang a world championship banner from 2017, then, this isn't the NCAA. They don't vacate records. So Bonds and Sosa and McGwire and those guys, I mean, they're still in the record book. I mean, what can you say? But anyway, getting back to what you were.
You and I are going to have to do a separate podcast on that about.
We could.
But here's my point I was going to make is that Cal Ripken going after Lou Gehrig's record. Hank said that those guys were having the time of their lives chasing these records, and he's going through pure hell, and that just bugged the heck out of him.
Yeah.
And there's little things like that that you don't think about, that how that would just eat away at him. And then his last interview, which was one of the best interviews I ever had with him, again in the fall of 2020, he was talking about that people really, there was emotion in his voice, talking about people just don't understand how tough that was going after that record. He said that I almost starved to death because he said that I couldn't leave my room. He said that hadn't it been for Ralph Garr and Dusty Baker, two of his black teammates who were like his unofficial sons, said one for them. He said, I wouldn't have anything to eat. They would bring me up sandwiches and that sort of thing. And just the pain in his voice, whenever he talked about that period, and there was pain in his voice, even up until almost the day he died, it just tells you that that was just such a traumatic thing.
How badly were his contributions devalued as an executive? Because you always got this sense, the idea, the common wisdom was that he was there because he was a figurehead. And I think anybody can sense that there was a whole lot more to Hank Aaron, the executive, than just being the face of the Braves or what have you. I mean, talk about that and talk about how he felt about that he's doing things there and nobody's really paying attention to it.
Jim, I got a whole chapter about this. I mean, this was, it was like a daily thing where Hank and I would talk about there's always something they had to deal with, this little petty stuff. And again, one of the things, and I think a lot of people, whether you're black or white, you can relate to a lot of things in the book along these lines, but particularly if you're a person of color, you can relate to all these little slights that would take place or that involve Hank Aaron, because it was Hank Aaron, but it was all of us. When I say all of us, I mean anybody who's African American, you can relate to it, where I'm listening like, yeah, I get it. But a couple of big things here. And let's start with one of the biggest thing, which is ongoing. The very last person, now Hank Aaron, for people who don't know, Hank Aaron was the farm director of the Braves for 14 years. And this was from like 1980 until about the early 1990s or so, and around in that stretch. The very last person that Hank Aaron hired as farm director was a guy by the name of Brian Snitker, okay? The guy who won the World Championship last year as manager for the Braves, the guy that is going to probably take him to close to another World Championship this year, the guy who almost led him to the World Series 3 years ago. He won like 2 or 3 National League Manager of the Year awards. People love Brian Snitker. That guy's great. That was the last person that Hank Aaron hired. Now, I'm making a big deal about that because that on itself is enough. But Hank Aaron, which I put in the book, talked about in detail about how people in the organization would just get on him about hiring Brian Snitker. They wanted him to fire him, saying that he's incompetent, he can't do this, he can't do that, blah, blah, blah. And Hank wouldn't listen to him. I think Hank kind of proved correctly on that one, okay?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that. You look at every year in the media guide, they will always put under his bio all of his baseball stats and career as a player. There'll be like one little paragraph that would say that, he was also, and I can't think of the exact wording, helpful, and I'm just making this part up, helpful in the status and the growth of Del Murphy in 1982 when they won the division championship. Well, it went a little bit further than that, okay? Because you look at the run of the Atlanta Braves, they hold the record in Major League Baseball for the winning 14 consecutive division titles, starting in 1970 to 1991. Everybody knows about that, with the 5 pennants and the World Championship in 1995. Well, if you look at the start of that run, half of that team, more than half of that team, started in the farm system run by Hank Aaron. Okay.
Yep.
We're talking about David Justice, Mark Lemke, Jeff Blauser, Tom Glavine. These are all Hank Aaron guys that drive Hank crazy. And then one of the biggest things I can point to, and this kind of caused a little conflict with me, Hank and Bobby Cox, the Hall of Fame manager, they did not get along. And most people did not know that, okay? As a matter of fact, Terry McGurk, who was the CEO of the Braves, He read my book and loved it.
Mhm.
And he was telling me, he paid me a great compliment. Terry McGurk was very close to Hank Aaron. He used to be his racquetball partner back in the day. And even Terry told me, he said that the overwhelming majority of the things I have in this book, he didn't know. He didn't realize this how Hank didn't like Bobby Cox. And it came to a head when Bobby Cox was being interviewed on television, and Bobby Cox basically took credit for acquiring Chipper Jones, future Hall of Fame third baseman for the Braves, when in fact, it was Hank Aaron. There's a whole backstory behind that. And Hank just blew up. And Hank said that, I want you to write something about this. And this story tells you about the relationship I have between, Hank and I have between ourselves. We had this understanding, then it was unspoken. If I wanted to find out anything that went on with the Atlanta Braves, I just pick up the phone and Hank would tell me. I very rarely did that because I didn't want to make it seem like it was a relationship where, as I point out in the book, like an ATM, where I could just keep drawing out funds.
Right.
So I was very calculated on how I used them. And likewise, as close of a friends as we were, Hank never violated the philosophy that I was a reporter first. And here's a classic example. Bobby Cox was a guy that was cooperative with the media, but he didn't say anything. That was his reputation.
Mm-hmm.
Unless he really, really trusted you. Well, I was a guy Bobby Cox really, really trusted. Bobby Cox told me a lot of stuff off the record. Okay.
Right.
So when I'm sitting here and I get that phone call from Hank and he's fuming about Bobby Cox, and I'm sitting there sweating like, oh, geez.
How am I going to get out of this, right?
And then he says, I want you to write something about it. I said, Hank, you know that before I write anything about you being upset with Bobby Cox, saying that Bobby Cox was responsible for getting to Chipper Jones, I'm going to have to talk to Bobby Cox to get his side of the story. And Hank said, go right ahead, by all means. That, to me, tells you about as much about Hank Aaron as anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The Barry Bonds home run chase and Hank's reluctance to play a role in the drama. Talk about that and talk about how he handled the whole thing.
Yeah, and I got to give you the background on this, and this is all in the book too. And this is kind of a two-parter. The first part, or maybe a three-parter. One part is something I mentioned before. Hank was traumatized. That's probably the best word. He was traumatized by that Babe Ruth chase, and he wanted nothing to do with Barry Bonds because everything about the Barry Bonds chase brought back memories to him about what went on with Babe Ruth. He knew people would be asking him about it. So the only person he would talk to during that period was me, which helped me because I was on ESPN every day and everything. Mm-hmm. They were asking me like, well, what is Hank thinking? Okay. And it was so weird. So I would go on ESPN, and then after I finished, Hank would call me up and said, hey, that was very good. Yeah, you said exactly what I was going to say. So that part of it. The other part of it is this, and I always like to stress this. Hank could care less about that record. He was proud of the record, but he wasn't obsessed with the record. Mm-hmm. Whether Barry Bonds broke it, Ken Griffey Jr., Mark McGwire, the man on the moon, he really didn't care. And I always point that out because a lot of people have told me or have insinuated that the reason Hank Aaron did not follow Barry Bonds or commented on Barry Bonds outside of me was because he was jealous of Barry Bonds breaking the record. No, he couldn't care less about that record. Now, let's get to something that's really huge here, which is in the book. Hank didn't have any problem with Barry Bonds, the player, for the most part, even with steroids, at least in the beginning. Now, he evolved over steroids as time went on. And in the beginning, his thing was, unless Barry Bonds or any of these guys says flat out that they use steroids to gain an advantage, he was going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Okay. And he stayed that almost to the end, but he started to change a little bit where the last 5 or 6 years of his life was like, no, steroids, they're bad. Okay. That's a whole nother side story. But when it came to Barry Bonds, the person, he could not stand them. And this should not be that surprising because they were two different people, two different eras. You got Hank growing up in the rural South, poor, no electricity, no running water. Barry, San Mateo. I mean, he drove a Trans Am I think it was a Trans Am, to Arizona State. I mean, rich family or well-to-do family, Bobby. And then you got the obvious thing that everybody knows about, the personalities, or oil and water. Okay, I was one of the few reporters who got along very well with Barry Bonds. I had one incident with Barry Bonds, which I'll talk about in the book, but for the most part, I got along fine with Barry Bonds. Most people did not get along.
I was going to say that was hard to do.
Yes, most people did not. Hank Aaron, if you couldn't get along with Hank Aaron, then something was wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
The two different personalities. So like I pointed out in the book, one of the greatest examples I gave was this famous commercial, Charles Schwab Super Bowl commercial, 2002, one of the greatest Super Bowl commercials of all time. People should Google that. It's a great commercial. It almost didn't happen, okay? Hank calls me up that fall. The commercial ran for the 2002 Super Bowl. He calls me up that fall of 2001, and he says, they want me to do this commercial, but I'm not going to do it. I said, what's the commercial? He said, nah, I'm just not going to do it. And I didn't press him on it, because if he didn't want to talk about it, I'm not going to press the great Hank Aaron to talk about something he don't want to talk about. Mm-hmm. Then he called me a few days later and said, I decided to do the commercial. So then he explained to me what the commercial was about. And I said, what caused you to change your mind? He says, well, because they promised me that I didn't have to be anywhere near or in the same vicinity or the same room with that guy, meaning Barry Bonds. And when you watch this commercial, Hank's scenes are shot at different times without Barry Bonds around. So that just kind of tells you about a little thing about what went on there.
I remember reading that and I'm thinking, this is priceless. Yeah. This is art. And he made a nice chunk of change out of it, and he didn't have to deal with Barry at all.
Well, and Jim, here's the thing too, is that I call myself in the book the Hank Aaron Whisperer, but under other circumstances, I might have been the Barry Bonds Whisperer, because Barry did tell me an awful lot. As a matter of fact, I did a story with Barry that went viral, and this was when Barry was the hitting coach of the Marlins, and he pulled me aside for an hour, and he just bore his soul about what a jerk he is. I would say the word he used, but since it's like a family thing, I better not say it. But he just was very honest about how bad he treated people. And he just bore his soul. And I must say that whenever I talk to not Hank, but Hank also, but to Barry was always very honest with me. And he was just telling me about how it was all his fault, the way he treated people and that sort of thing. And I bring that up because the summer before, or I should say the year before he broke the record, I was in San Francisco covering that opening series between the Giants and the Braves. And I walk into the Giants clubhouse, and I'm working at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at the time, I should say. And walking to the Giants clubhouse, and as you know, Jim, and the Giants clubhouse back then, they had what they call Barry's World. And this was where Barry had his own little section with the big screen TVs and what have you. And nobody was allowed in Barry's World unless you were asked to, which was like never. Right? Particularly a reporter. So I walk in and Barry sees me and he just called me T. He says, hey, T, come on over. And Giants writers look at me like, how are you getting this special treatment from this guy? So I go over to Barry and we're just kind of shooting the breeze a little bit. So then Barry says, if I were in your situation, if I was a black reporter covering a black guy like me, I would be kinder to you than you've been to me. And what I was referring to, I was on ESPN a lot of different shows, and I was blasting Barry Bonds for not doing it the right way, hitting home runs compared to the way Hank Aaron did. And then I said, Barry, what did I say that's wrong? He couldn't answer. So he was almost semi-listening to me. That's my story, and I'm sticking to that too also. But the other thing that was interesting, Barry said, why doesn't Hank ever call me? I mean, he never calls me. He never gets in contact with me. So then I said, Barry, why does Hank have to call you? What if you want to Hank? Here's Hank's number. You want to call Hank? He never wanted Hank's number, but just sat there and complained about that. Okay.
Maybe he knew Susan Bailey wouldn't let him through.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Provide the direct number for him. But a lot of this, I think, I speculate on this. A couple of things is, number one, again, I think deep down inside he kind of knew he messed up. Okay, steroid. And number two, he also had great respect for Hank Aaron, even though he may not have shown it a lot of times. But the other thing about Barry Bonds, I know this is Barry Bonds, talking about Hank Aaron, but the Barry Bonds, this is important because consider the contrast between the two. Barry Bonds, in many ways, is misunderstood. He is really, at least from my perspective, and I've dealt with him since he was a rookie with the Pirates, he really is a very sensitive guy. And part of the thing that came out in that story of mine that went viral, it was a long story, was he said that he just got into this character role of being a jerk. Again, he used another word. And he said he just couldn't get out of it. He just couldn't, just it's kept mushrooming out of control. But my point is, he's really a sensitive guy, and it really did bother him that he could not get this relationship with Hank Aaron, and probably knew he was never going to have that relationship.
Yeah, yeah, and I had thought, watching Barry over the years, that some of that came from his dad. Some of that came from Bobby because of the experiences Bobby had and the way he was scarred, both in the minor leagues and then once he got to the Giants and got into the major leagues. And that Barry basically learned from Bobby, don't ever let your guard down. Don't ever let anybody pierce that or anybody see your vulnerability.
Well, I got a slightly different theory, because I dealt with Bobby, the father, not as a player, but as a coach later on in the years. Mm-hmm. Of course, Bobby had the tragic alcohol problem, as we all know. Yeah. But I didn't really see that from Bobby. And the person I think that was more of a negative influence on him, and this is going down a different road, is Willie Mays.
Okay.
I helped Willie Mays a lot, and that was good, and that was bad. I mean, Willie Mays, I bring it up because Willie Mays was Barry Bonds' godfather, and tying this into Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, just two totally different people. Okay, on the positive for Hank Aaron. Okay, mm-hmm. Willie Mays, I mean, he was like an analogy. He was like the old movie Forrest Gump. He was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. I mean, it was sometimes it'd be okay, and there's something, yeah. And that was Barry's godfather, and he was always seeing him as a role model, even more so than Bobby, because Willie Mays is still alive, obviously. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the way this ties into Hank, by the way, you read this part in the book, and this kind of tells you about Willie's personality that perhaps that Barry was seeing. That in 1972, October 1972, after Jackie Robinson died, Hank Aaron went to Ernie Banks and Willie Mays and said that now that Jackie has died, and remember, Jackie Robinson was this great civil rights advocate.
Right.
He said, so Hank said that now that Jackie has died, it's up to us to carry on his legacy. And Hank told me that both Willie Mays and Ernie Banks said, no, we're not going to do that. And they just went running the other way. They don't want no part. They don't want that to, in their minds, to ruin their image. And this tells you an awful lot about Hank. Hank said, you know what? I'll do it myself. So that just kind of gives you the personality between Hank and also a Willie Mays that perhaps rubbed off on Barry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I remember reading that, and I remember thinking, with Ernie Banks, that was to be expected, because he was Mr. Let's Play 2, and every day was a sunny day, and he had that image and didn't want anything to mar that. Willie, I don't know. Yeah, and I see it, I get it, but it's not like Willie had a perpetually sunny experience either.
No.
I mean, he had issues in San Francisco when he tried to buy a house. I mean, you'd have understood.
Well, see, and here is, and this ties into blacks in baseball, which is a big part of my book. The frustration a lot that has happened, and I remember I talked to Joe Morgan about this, that these guys, like a Willie Mays, for instance, they knew what was going on with blacks in baseball and what have you. And by the way, Willie Mays wanted nothing to do with that series back in '82.
Okay.
They did not want to talk about it. Okay. They didn't want to help the cause. And that's always been the case throughout history, certainly from an African-American standpoint. I mean, you go back, this is not anything to know. You go back to slavery. I mean, there were people who were happy being in master's house because they weren't getting beaten. Okay. Not beating me, so why should I complain? Right? Mm-hmm. So, just use that as an extreme analogy. But I mean, so yeah, it's not totally surprising that the people who have the courage enough to stand out and say stuff, you can generally count on one hand, and just about any situation in life.
Terence, this has been an absolute pleasure. Just like the book was an absolute pleasure, and I don't know how it's selling, but I hope it sells even more.
I appreciate that, and you asked very good questions. You must be a reporter or something.
I've been told that. Yeah, I still am a working journalist. My pay reflects it, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for doing this. And another chapter of the Pandemic Baseball Book Club.
Thank you very much.
You got it.